All right, let's let people in because it looks like there's as many as 44 attendees who wanted to come.
All
Isn't
right.
that great? Thank you for attending 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium Session 122, titled Taking Off the Name Tag, Why Some Missionaries Leave the LDS Church for Good. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for approximately 3 months, beginning at the end of August 2020. Please type your questions, if you have any during our session, into the Whova app to be addressed during the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There's more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. As a returned missionary, what does it mean to leave the LDS Church? Some struggle to reconcile leaving behind the doctrines of the church without leaving behind their loved ones. While some family members assume that it's a phase that will pass, others feel a deep sense of loss. Grief is felt on all sides and often contributes to misunderstanding and stigmatization. Disaffiliation with the church is often a complex journey of holding on and letting go, but some factors make understanding this process difficult. Through interviewing returned missionaries and analyzing previous studies, this study highlights potential problems with how the church reports membership data, commonly held experiences of those who leave, and how we can promote understanding on all sides. I'll take a second to introduce our speaker before we begin. Dawn Dimmick is a recently graduated student from the Utah State University with degrees in religious studies and international studies. She will soon be attending Chicago Theological Seminary, where she will pursue a Master's of Divinity in order to become an Army chaplain. I'm now going to turn the time over to our presenter. If you will remember, please put your questions into the Whova app for addressing at the end. All right, Dawn, the time is yours.
All right, let's make sure this is working. Can you see my screen?
Yes, but you're not quite yet in present mode.
All right, let's see. How are we now?
Looks perfect.
All right, thank you, Benjamin. Hi, everyone. So I want to thank Benjamin for that introduction to begin with. As they mentioned, I plan on becoming a chaplain, which is sort of what led me to this research. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on what led me to this question specifically. So I started to become interested in this when just to give you a little bit more background on myself, when I was serving a mission. I was in Russia, and I had a mission companion who ended up sharing some of their personal background with me, and some really heartbreaking stories of sexual abuse she had experienced at the hands of church leaders and things of that nature. And it just really weighed on my mind of how she could stay a member of the church and what motivated her to stay, really. And for her specifically, what to is that she had transcendent experiences through the church that just defied any sort of injustices that she had felt. But that question just still begged in my mind and heart. I continued to go throughout my mission, and as I interacted with my own personal friends and family members, many who have left the church, and then just started to get involved in different communities with the military and with interfaith groups on campus. And that question was just a big one. That there's a lot of returned missionaries who I was talking to, some who had stayed, some who were navigating their faith, and some who had completely left, and their stories weren't really told. And I became very passionate about it and wanting to understand their stories better, and decided to take this on as my capstone with Dr. Patrick Mason. So we came at this together. So it's been a lot of fun. COVID got in the way of a little bit of it. We were able to do a lot of in-person interviews. Well, I did. I did it with his supervision, but there's a lot more that needs to be done and can be done, and I'm excited to be part of this kind of emerging area of research that is coming out with the church, and a lot of people that are involved in this circle. So I'm excited to be at Sunstone. This is the first time I've ever interacted with Sunstone. Dr. Mason's the one who told me about it, so bear with me. I'm going to do my best here and just share what I found out and some of my insights, and I'm excited for the Q&A so we can learn more together. All right, so let's break down the question itself. I wanted to start with, so this is kind of the overview of what my presentation will look like. We'll go into the background of the question itself, the aims of what my study were, the methods, the hypothesis that I had, significance, and then the meat of it will be the sources and initial findings that I found. There are articles from other church members who talked about that difference, where we have such an emphasis, the rite of passage almost of young people going on missions at such a crucial time. The idea of a missionary is usually somebody who's very committed to their faith, and in order to give up, a year and a half to 2 years, or however much time you serve, you expect a certain level of commitment and personal knowledge of the faith to just want to go out, and especially during that time when you could be dating or going to college and all those things. So it's interesting because that's a lot of people's perceptions of missionaries, and it's confusing then why a missionary would leave the church that they spent years preaching about if they were committed at that level to begin with. So one of the things that I analyzed and evaluated was what level of because a large number of missionaries have a faith crisis, whether it's before, during, or after returning home from mission. And so when you look at an individual's experience and you look at the commonalities over a broad range of individual experiences, there are patterns. However, you really can't generalize because every person's experience is unique to them. So one missionary might be committed to serving for a different reason than somebody else, or it might be a combination of factors. So that's something to understand when you go into the next part of, I just have these on there to show the rite of passage kind of idea and the cultural narratives around serving a mission. It's kind of fun, the Mormon ads and Lehonas. So in order to understand why a missionary or return missionary might leave the church, you have to understand where they started with to begin with and what kind of experiences they bring to the table. And one of the questions that we need to understand with the background is, what does it mean to leave the church? And there's beginning to be a lot more dialogue about this, but there's a difference between, from organizational standpoint, what it means to leave the church, and then from an individual's own experience and religious identification. with a member of the church there who was considered inactive and not really a member of the church because she just thought it was too far away to go to the church meeting house, to be honest. And she loved the church and was very much identified and read all the church magazines and paid her tithing and all those sort of things. But she was considered inactive, an inactive member that we were supposed to go visit because she didn't attend church. Where I also, one of the people that I interviewed, he would still attend church because his wife wanted him to, but he was a returned missionary, and he had decided a while, like pretty quick after his mission, that he didn't want to be a member of the church anymore, and after being married in the temple, but still was trying to keep a social bond there with his wife and just keep the peace, and still went to church and did the things that would make him consider him a member of the church. So that's just something important to remember when we talk about that word. What does it mean to leave the church? So moving forward, I'll use disassociate a lot more. I like that word better, but that's just something to keep in mind. And then I put these quotes on there because this is another interesting thing from the organizational standpoint, is that there have been, historically, the LDS Church has claimed that there aren't a large number of missionaries or people that leave the church. And these are some of the quotes that I saw on Yahoo questions and just Google searches that I did, where there is really no way of counting returned missionaries who leave the church, because very few people actually get the records removed, which would disassociate them completely. And lastly, another important thing to remember is just the landscape of organized religion, the American experience with religion is we have millennials and young adults that are self-identifying as nuns at a larger rate than any other generation and just in history. So it's becoming, that's important to remember, because as we talk about returned missionaries in the church that fall into this category, into this demographic, that's going to affect their experience and navigating their identity, because it's not unique to our church. So young people are shying away from institutional spirituality in general, and that's not unique to our church, but what is unique is that we send our young people out on religiously hefty and demanding spiritual experiences. So they come to this landscape from a different lens, where they've lived fully committed lives, at least externally, for a month to a year, however long their mission is, and then they have to come navigate this question or commitment to a church with those deeply personal experiences, social connections, and spiritual identity. So let's see. And this is something that Reese talks about in her book. I'll quote Reese quite a bit, Jenna Reese, because she did a lot of research from belief to disbelief, or if there is a shift at all, like I mentioned, some people come to the mission experience from a different place, and that could be, based off of some of the missionaries come from multi-faith families to begin with, and then others come from their whole family is LDS. Other people came from a place where their faith was the religious majority, and others where it was the minority. So all those things are going to affect their mission experience and how they transition afterwards. And then we'll just continue to grapple with what it means to leave the church, and then analyze whether or not the factors are isolated to the church and mission experience or to religiosity in general. So what I did was just do some surveys and interviews. I had a loose set of questions. I mainly just let them share their stories, and I guided it with a couple of questions so that I could compile it into something digestible and identify any larger patterns that I noticed. I was hesitant to identify any single factor as the reason for why returned missionaries leave the church, but I put it underneath 3 main umbrella reasons, and most everything else that I had researched or found out fell underneath those 3 reasons. And let's see, so this is what I went into the study with, was that the number of returned missionaries who no longer identify as members of the church is larger than reported, and that the disassociation of missionaries with the church is often correlated with general rejection of organized religion and that tension and stigmatization between individuals, families, and church communities stems from a deep sense of grief and perceived loss. And that's one I'm going to try to focus a good amount of time on, as the theme is grief this year with Sunstone. And I think it's something that we haven't really talked too much about. Okay, so some of the significance. This is one, I like the quote. I'm going to start with this quote on the screen. One of the individuals that I interviewed mentioned this, and they said, no one actually ever wants to know why we left. They just want to know so they convince us that we're wrong. And that was kind of heartbreaking to me. And I could see how that could be felt. And I think that more studies need to be done so that returned missionaries, young people, whether they're still members of the church or not, have their stories and voices heard, because it is such a unique experience, and a huge portion of the upcoming church have served missions, and it's important to understand that experience to, even develop better policies, and the church is doing some things to change the mission experience or to better it, however you want to look at it. So there are some policy changes that are happening, and I think that those might be important, but they could be damaging in some ways. There's just a lot of, it's a whole new landscape. So there's a lot of research that needs to be done, and listening to the voices of those who experience it is, I feel like, the most important way to move forward. And it's the only way I feel like we're going to really be able to destigmatize those who leave their experience, and to bridge understanding between those who stay in the church, who stay behind, and those who leave. All right, so the first question that I asked was, did you feel like you were converted or truly believed before going on your mission? And I am gonna mainly share some of the stories from those that I talked to, because I feel like that's kind of where the fruit is here, as I mentioned. And so that first quote, I talked to a girl who, she mentioned having a family they had traveled around a lot, so she already had a lot of interaction with diversity. And she had a lot of really cool experiences growing up, and her parents had served missions, and she knew from a very early age that she wanted to have that experience. So she wasn't sure what she was going to do with her life in general post-mission, or before she went on her mission. She wasn't sure if she was going to go to school or a lot of different things. So for her, the main thing was the experience. She said she didn't really have a strong testimony. She just it was almost it was a tradition in her family to go. She saw how beneficial it was for her parents, and so she wanted to go as well. So that was a common thread. And even as I talked to, just in conversations that I've had with other family members and people about the project, or just in life in general, my younger sister had mentioned, I might want to serve a mission, but I feel like I need to be really committed to, the doctrines, and there's some things that I don't necessarily believe in, so I don't know if I should go. I just kind of don't know what to do right now with my life. So that same concept. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just interesting and important to remember. And then that second one, this one was from a young man who similarly was not sure of many of the doctrines, some of the core ones, like Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon. He mentioned having a very solid testimony of God and prayer, but not of many of the more historical things with the church and the restoration message. And so his motivation, he really felt like, if I give up these couple years of my life to really focus on this, then I'm going to get my answer one way or the other. So for him, his mission was the testing ground of, I want to find out whether or not this is true, so I'm going to go on a mission. So there are a lot of different reasons that propel people to serve missions. Some people are completely dedicated to the desire to teach others the truths they hold close. And for others, the primary reason stems from family and societal pressures. I got that from a lot of people, was that there was a level of expectation to serve, and others just didn't know what to do with their life at that point. And the mission was just an opportunity to leave home. So individuals bring their own experiences into the field, like we talked about. And then I asked, the second question was, were there any experiences on your mission that caused you to question church teachings or membership in the church? So I found three main things that I was interested in that came up in a lot of different interviews. And one of them was interaction with diversity. And this one, that same young man who went to find out whether or not the church was true with the restoration message and things like that, went to Japan on a mission and witnessed a healing. Pretty much, I believe that he mentioned it was a Buddhist healing ritual where a man had broken his arm and it was healed. And that was something because so after that happened, they were teaching this man. So the man came to them and was like, "Oh, my arm was healed by this, shaman or somebody else in another faith tradition." And then they went to their mission president about it and like, "What do we do about this?" And they essentially gave a priesthood blessing to reverse the healing and said that it was a demonic nature and power and things of that nature. So that was an experience that really impacted the individual that I interviewed because they really felt confused at why, they saw this power from another faith tradition and then were told that it was of the devil and things of that. And so that interaction with a different faith and some power behind that faith was really problematic for this individual navigating their faith identity on the mission, especially where they're trying to find out answers to their own questions. And they had some interaction with diversity. They grew up in a pretty diverse area of the world, but just in terms of religious diversity, it was not as much, they hadn't dealt with those sort of questions. So that's just one example of a specific type of diversity they experienced. But there were other commonalities with just, starting to talk when you're talking to so many different people about faith for probably the first time in your life. And so there's a lot of questions that you get asked, and we know this. There's a lot of, whether it's propaganda or material, however you want to look at it, there's a lot of different material that comes up, whether about the LDS faith that they're challenged with or just about other people's faith commitments. And then the last point on here was mission specific conflict. And this is an area that I feel like definitely needs to be more research done, because each mission, while the structure is very similar, the culture of that mission is unique to the mission, because you have a leadership structure set up where you have a mission president. So even some missionaries will talk about one mission president having a specific sort of mission, and then once they switch a mission president halfway through, the mission changes like pretty drastically for these missionaries and their experiences. So you have very specific leadership dynamics and interactions that affect a missionary's experience with doctrines, with the church, with that mission experience in general, and how they're going to look at it. And one of the people I interviewed shared about her story. She came back early from her mission, but she had two experiences on her mission that really highlighted some things that she struggled with. And one of them was she struggled with depression, and this was a common thing as well, was mental illnesses on the mission, and to various levels and degrees. But she had pretty bad depression, and some of it was rooted in some experiences she had at the hand of church leadership when she was younger, also sexual abuse and things of that nature. She was on a mission, and she was going to therapy for her depression and things of that nature. And she was pretty much told to grin and bear it, and that she wasn't trying hard enough, and that the atonement would fix everything if she was faithful. And so that was really difficult for her, because she felt like she was trying to do everything that she could. And, she was focusing full time on the church, and she still wasn't getting the help that she needed. And it became very, just led her to a deeper depression and then a desire to go home eventually. But another experience that she had on her mission was teaching a young unmarried couple about the law of chastity. And they were told that that one of them needed to go live in a hotel until they got married, but they were living in poverty and they had a young child. And so there was a disconnect there where she, really felt, I shouldn't be telling these people to split apart, and they need to be together as a family unit and things of that nature. And I'm not saying that is direct doctrine of the church or what the church would say to do, but that's what she was told to do as a missionary. And she really struggled with that, with reconciling her own instinctual behavior and ideas and perspectives, and then what she was being told. And I saw that quite a bit as well. whether it was a discussion with a church leader on the mission or after the mission when it came to some more muddy areas of doctrine or questions and how they were handled. There was a lot of people really struggled to, a lot of return missionaries really struggled to reconcile their own internal beliefs and what they were being told. Let me go back. One more thing I was going to mention is that it would be really neat to take into account on further studies like culture shock, rate of rejection, that the effect of mental or emotional or physical illness, living conditions, attitude toward gender, and I mean, both within the faith community and outside of it. All of those things I think would be interesting in studies moving forward, because there are so many things that came up in the interviews. I was like, that could be a pattern, that could be something that affected your experience, and it would be interesting to isolate certain variables and factors and just see if there are overarching patterns there. All right, so moving on, the third question I asked was, were there any experiences after your mission that caused you to question church teachings or membership in the church? So I really just wanted to see this kind of linear idea of what experiences they had before, during, and after their mission. And that also helped them in sharing their story to just kind of frame it. But once the mission experience is complete, every missionary is going to go through a transition period. So oftentimes there's a shift as the missionary renavigates their identity, because you're not a missionary anymore, but you're not the person you were before you left on your mission. So there's a level of identity reconciliation that has to happen. Everybody goes through, and especially there's a communal aspect where you go from being part of a group or community, and like I mentioned, it's so unique to that group that is there at that specific time with that specific mission president in that area. So you go from being part of a very unique and specific community and group, and then there's a level of loss that's experienced when that's taken away. So you hold on to it in certain ways. It's so much a core part of who you are, and whether you want it to be or not. So some seek that community in other places. Others come home to newer reoccurring family tensions. A lot of times, I had this happen to me personally, and then other individuals shared this sentiment as well, but a lot of times you have members of your family or somebody that your family mentions in the ward family who's left the church, or, you hear about all those sort of things on your mission. And then when you come home from your mission, you're expected to be this, strong member of the church, and you're, not everyone who would leave. So that's where there's a level of expectation that coming back from a mission that you have. So the missionary might feel unfulfilled. They might hold higher expectations for themselves or feel it from others. They might want to spend time doing anything unrelated to church. They've just spent 1.5 to 2 years or however long they were on their mission, giving their life fully to the church. And for some people, they just need a break, especially if there is levels of burnout on the mission or different things like that, or any discontent. So some might be eager to get a job, begin dating, or go to school, and some might be terrified of those things. Some look at the 1.5 or 2 years with joy, while others look at, a 4 or 5 month mission that ended early and feel failure or hurt. And that rich pluralism of the individual experience shows the risk in generalizing the very personal nature of the mission in relation to their faith commitments. It's so much more complex than I think we want to realize. And I'm going to get into this later, but when we look at it from an outside perspective, and we're not the individual going through that experience, we want to simplify it. We want it to be more black and white, and there to be a single factor or experience that led them to leave the church, because that makes more sense to us. But it's very complex, and there's a lot that goes into it. And I think that's the starting point in understanding, is recognizing that we're not ever going to fully understand. So our job isn't necessarily to fix or to understand, but to try to give a space to be heard. And, it goes both ways. So I'm going to get into that in a little bit. And then I asked the question, do you consider yourself an active member of the LDS Church? This might seem confusing, because my research was on why return missionaries leave the church, so the ones who leave. But I wanted to ask this question because I wanted to hear how they navigated that term, an active member, just going back to that conversation we had earlier on what it means to disassociate from the church. And what I think that most of us realize in this community, especially, that the term active and inactive does little in identifying where a person is at in their spiritual journey and their relationship with the church. But there are a myriad of reasons why someone might not get their name removed, and why they might consider themselves a member of the church still, or why they might not. And I put some of the quotes on here that I really liked. One of them was, they were really adamant about needing to distance themselves from the church. And so my question was, why don't you get your name removed then? You know, if you don't want to be associated anymore, why not do that? And they really just said they don't see the point in putting in the effort. They didn't want to, they were at a level of wanting to disassociate where they didn't even want to deal with it. And for their personal identification, they definitely don't identify as a member of the church, but the church can still claim that they are a member, or that maybe they're just going through, you know, a period of time of inactivity. And that's one of the things on that last quote. There was a BYU study done, and this was a while ago. They had done surveys in 1999, but they concluded that almost 9 out of 10 returned missionaries continue to regularly attend church after their missions. And Missionaries actually did a little research on this recently, and returned missionaries do state, if they've completed the whole 1.5 or 2-year mission, do attend at higher rates, and aren't as inactive according to LDS terminology. But it is interesting because the faith journey is fluid. So you have to give space. You have to give space for that to be fluid. But at the same time, the organization can then use that to claim that larger numbers of people are in the church than they might not be. So from my research and what I did, there was a lot of people a lot of return missionaries who have disassociated and don't see themselves returning, but they haven't taken their name off of the records. And this isn't necessarily problematic until we start making claims. So from an organizational standpoint, if the church was to start claiming things about return missionaries in numbers, then that could be an issue, because the definition of what it means to leave the church is different from their perspective versus the individual's perspective. And Brooks talks about this in his book. I gathered a lot of information from his findings as well. He was an outsider who came, like, from a scholastic standpoint. He was a religious outsider to the faith majority and came to Utah and met with a lot of returned missionaries who had left the church. And he had said gathering accurate data on the actual number of apostates from Mormonism is nearly impossible. And I would second that, because of the difference in terminology that we use. And let's see. So one of the main points that I found from my study was that the transition from membership to disaffiliation is not a linear journey. I love, love, love this quote. I just in a conversation with a friend yesterday who has decided to leave the church mentioned this, and they were like, yes, this is so true. It is a recursive process of negotiating both intimacy and estrangement from that which has been rejected. A lot of times, those that stay behind in the church don't recognize that push and pull struggle that people are experiencing that decide to leave the church, especially returned missionaries. Because again, when you've given up so much of your time and your focus is completely on something that you're now trying to distance yourself from, it's become such a core part of your identity. And so figuring out how to hold on to those things that you hold dear, and those people and relationships and friendships that you might have built, and other parts of yourself that have developed because of that experience, while letting go of those things that are causing you pain and hurt, is a process. And it's not from point A to point B. It's, ups and downs, and wanting to stay close and talk about things, and then not wanting to talk about things, and feeling a lot of anger and hurt. And it manifests itself in a lot of different emotions, which can be extremely difficult for those who stay behind in the church. And let's see. So I think we're going to get into that conversation in a minute. One of the last, I think I have 2 more questions that I asked them, and then we'll start talking about how to bridge this divide and just understand each other better. So I asked them to narrow it down to one word of what brought you to the point of leaving the church. And one of the reasons I wanted them to do this was because I had sat in a class about a year ago, and it was an interfaith class, and we did an exercise where we said, okay, this is how I identify. I identify as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ, excuse me, of Latter-day Saints or whatever it may be. I identify as agnostic or spiritual but not religious. So you say your identification, and then you highlight some things that you appreciate, that bring you joy, that benefit you from your faith tradition, the things you hold most dear. And then you identify some that are problematic, that you struggle with, that you might not agree with, that bring you pain. And then you say, what do I want others to know about my faith? And it was a really beautiful experience because I had never sat down and done that. I had a lot of thoughts about the things that I had a hard time with in the church. But more interestingly, as we went around the room, everybody had something to say about something that was problematic within their faith tradition or worldview or framework. Nobody was absolutely 100% satisfied with whatever they had chosen to believe or how they framed the world. And we were all able to see the limitations of our faith traditions. And so this question was interesting to me because I wanted to see, there had to be a line at some point where that dissatisfaction was too much to identify at that point. There was too much disconnect, too much dissonance, and the individual felt like they needed to leave the church. And so I wanted them to look at after they shared their whole story and experience, to identify maybe what the main thing that they felt really was the breaking point or deal breaker. And part of this too was helpful in, as I framed my research, was just creating sort of the umbrella reasons or ideas. So these are not all inclusive, but they do give some direction in areas that we can focus in on in further research and just in understanding things ourselves. So the first one is truth claims. And then also a lot of these match up with research that Missionaries has done and other scholars have done in the church. So truth claims was a big one. One of the individuals that I talked about, she said, the heroes in my life and in these stories became the villains. I felt like I knew nothing and everything. And they gave reason to the way that I was already feeling. So they had felt disconnected, but then finding out information that, was antagonistic or just proved the way that they were feeling was what did it for them. They were like already feeling disconnected. They were trying to ignore that. But then when they heard certain things, they were like, this is why, this is not a place for me. I don't belong here, or I don't want to be here anymore. And the second one, this is a big one, was expectations. So one of the expectations was, I would probably argue in almost every story to some degree, for a lot of people, that expectation from the Ward family when you came home, or just society, to be this super strong believing person, and the expectations of getting married pretty quickly in the temple and creating a life that just modeled other people's. That was a pressure and expectation that a lot of these missionaries felt, that they didn't necessarily align with what they wanted in their life, and they didn't feel like they could fit that mold. And that was one of all three of these things are kind of aligned. I see them as cyclical. They feed into one another. But the third point was liberation, was that people were tired of playing a role. There was a couple of people who mentioned that phrase, and that the first quote underneath that one was from the woman who left her mission early and was in therapy and things like that. But she said, I had to realize that the church wasn't helping me, and I had to find a different way to help myself. So where the church might answer questions for some people and bring some people joy, we have to be comfortable with the idea that it might be painful and hurtful for other people. And that was what she had to come to find for herself, was that it was just not working for her, and she needed to help herself independent of the church. And then the last one was awareness. So all those things kind of feed into each other, but those were the main findings that I noticed from the surveys that I did and interviews. This was my research ended up going a direction that I didn't expect, but that was interesting. So this idea or concept, I'm going to go to the next one first. Let's see. Okay, so this was the last question that I asked, was how do you orient to religion? So most every respondent identifies as spiritual but not religious, or as one person said, hopefully agnostic. So the common thread was an understanding that no one church could be true. So that takes me back to this. As I was talking about this research to a chaplain, as I've been doing this journey with chaplaincy, I was talking to a chaplain down at Fort Douglas, and a little bit of background, they're just a religious advisor and spiritual personnel for the military. So they can be a counselor or guide, and they just provide for the free exercise of religion. And part of what they do is a lot of one-on-one interviews with soldiers. And so this individual had come to Utah, had been stationed there for about a year at this point when I was talking to them. And they didn't think I was LDS. I do identify as a member of the church still. And so they didn't think that I was LDS because the LDS church hasn't endorsed females in the past. And so we started this conversation, and I started talking about how I'm doing research on why returned missionaries leave the church and everything. And then it transitioned as he discovered that I was a member of the church and was just really wanted to talk about this phenomenon that he had seen occurring. And he just kept talking about how he had a lot of soldiers who had come to him and who had served missions for the LDS church and then had left Jesus behind altogether, is the way that he worded it. He was like, why do they leave Jesus behind, where they've given up, they're so committed to the gospel, and then they just leave it all together, and they're not religious anymore. And I hadn't really grappled with that or thought about that, but as I interviewed individuals, they started saying things like, I realized that nothing could be true if the church wasn't true, or I'm never going to count on anything fully again. Or the concept, one person talked about a primary, like an experiment thing, or just an example, the metaphor of like puzzle pieces. They just explained something they had heard in primary and in young women's growing up about how everything else had a piece, but that was it. So if they left the LDS church, then where else would they go? And that's what the last individual said was, I don't know where I would go. If anything, I'd rather just research on my own right now. So this kind of ties into the theological standpoint of the one true church. And it was such an interesting connection for me to make because of my passion for interfaith. And we'll get into this a little bit about how I think we can bridge this theological standpoint with execution of it. But the church does have very exclusivist truth claims of being the one true church, or God, that Jesus is at the helm, right? And so when people decide to leave the church, whether they're returned missionaries or not, it's difficult to want to go anywhere else because everywhere else is just seen as having a portion of truth. And so what happens is that individual, it's kind of an all or nothing mentality. It's the church or nothing. And coupled with the religious landscape right now, where, you don't need a religion necessarily to connect with the transcendent or God, right? And so all those things create this interesting phenomenon, I would say, as I was talking to this chaplain, where these young people who have spent so much of their life and time up to that point focused on Jesus don't, swing on the other side of the pendulum. And as I was exploring this concept, I was talking to a returned missionary who is still very committed to the faith. And we were talking about my project, of course, because that's all I could talk about at the time. But their quote was the second one on here, where they started talking about how every other religion and every other person is doing the best that they can with what they have, but they're still wrong. And he said, I think of all the blessings that they're missing out on because they don't have the true gospel. And so hearing him talk about his experience or how he views things theologically for the one true church, and then hearing the first quote from a returned missionary who left the church was really interesting, because I think that and understanding these two different standpoints is where we can bridge. So this individual said it gets drilled into that everybody else is secretly miserable because they're not in the church. And as a missionary, it's your job to share the secret to happiness. And I just found out that wasn't true, that there's lots of happy people with great lives just trying to do the best they can. And Brooks actually mentions this too in his book. He says, life without the church is assumed to be discrepant and spiritually empty. So a happy apostate or person who has left the church is a threatening reversal of this most basic logic that true fulfillment can only be found in the church. So understanding that, we can start to understand sort of some of the grief that those who stay behind in the church experience, because it makes you question your own worldview and faith when people around you are leaving it and they are happy. So it's easier to stigmatize and to say, oh, well, they're not actually happy, or they're going to come back around because, you know, they're going to remember the good things about the gospel, or whatever the story is. And a lot of these stigmas that we've heard circulating around the church that create these divisions comes from this place, I feel like, of fear and insecurity, in large part. And it's because of this idea of grief and perceived loss, because something that we hold dear as a member of the church is being let go of by somebody else and they're happy. You know, we can't reconcile with that, or we have a difficult time reconciling that. So that's one of the things in a couple of slides we're going to get into, and I'm going to wrap up here so we can do Q&A. But one of the girls that I interviewed talked about being in those meetings where we talk about reactivating people. So for a returned missionary, this is even heightened, this stigma and feeling of isolation and division from those within the church, because they were told, you know, that they spent time going after inactive people or trying to cultivate those relationships. And that's something that they know is coming their way, really. And heartbreakingly, that second part of it, knowing that her dad stands at the pulpit talking about his wayward daughter, she actually had somebody come to her from the church that she worked with that said, yeah, your dad talked about you at the pulpit. And so those sort of behaviors are really damaging to relationships. And then the second one was someone else is grieving me not being there. And that one was a big one. On a personal note, that I went through with my husband was that he had decided to disassociate from the church. And for me, it wasn't the end of the world, but obviously my relationship and how I understood my own covenants and beliefs had to shift and were up for scrutiny. So I was reconciling who he was to me at that point. And that was something that he had said, was someone else is grieving me not being there, and having to watch your loved ones and people go through that is hard. And a lot of missionaries wanted to remove themselves from it because they saw that as less damaging in the long run. And then, let's see, so we're going to skip those. So going along with that conversation, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about why it's hard for those who stay behind, because we talk a lot, a lot of my study was focused on why return missionaries leave and sharing their stories. But in order to really bridge understanding and for them to feel heard, both sides have to understand each other. We have to open up this conversation about why it's difficult for those who stay behind too, because grief is experienced on all sides. And that's why it's the grief and the loss is manifested as stigma and division. And I would say, so these are some of the main reasons why, or that we only see the external indicators of departure. We often don't see that whole journey that return missionaries go through. And again, we can't understand it completely. So we try to make sense of it. And it's easier to rationalize or to talk about their behaviors rather than what they might be feeling. The second one is that the familial and word bonding elements of missionary service, where it is such a big part of the LDS church to go on missions, and the sort of rite of passage and cultural attachments to that experience, that is it feeds into when return missionaries leave, because it's not just an individual thing. Everybody else has to decide how they're going to navigate with the individual who left, or what that means for them now personally. And then I kind of talked already about the personal reconciliation of faith and just how it makes you have to view your own faith commitments. And then the last one, this is one that's more sensitive to talk about, is that the individual might have a moral or faith obligation to their decisions or actions that come across as aggressive and judgmental, because we honestly just don't know how to communicate sometimes. We have a difficult time communicating where we come from and our beliefs in a way that's not threatening or accusatory of people who might not believe in the same things. And then, let's see. So how do we create a safer atmosphere for everyone? This is just kind of what I've come to, what I put together here. And it's not perfect, but I feel like we have to learn how to minimize the divide between those in the church and those outside of it. And I think one way to do that is to recognize the faith journey is fluid. And I'm not saying just for those who leave the church, but those within the church. And we recognize that we're all, you take those macro concepts of grace and forgiveness and these principles of the church and really remember that we're all on journeys, and that these terms we use, like leaving and active and inactive, are not important. They're not as important as connecting with people as humans, whether they're in the church or outside of it. We're part of our pews or go to a different church or don't go to a church now anymore. The second thing is allowing everyone's experiences to speak for themselves. So we have to stop rationalizing and saying this is why they left the church. And as my husband left the church, I had people ask me, what was it? Why did he leave? And I'm like, why don't you ask him? Don't ask me why he left, because it's not my story to tell. So letting people tell their stories is so important. The third thing is don't make statements and ask questions. This kind of is just self-explanatory. I feel like it goes along with that second point, because going back to that original quote where the returned missionary said they don't actually want to know our stories, they just want to know so they can convince us where we're wrong. Stop making statements, stop approaching things from your moral high ground, and just asking questions is important. And I think on the other side of the spectrum too, for those returned missionaries who have left, in order to bridge family tensions and divides and to feel understood, just opening up that dialogue with questions and not accusing or statements. And then church members cannot have a monopoly on happiness or truth. This one is so important. And just recognizing that truth is everywhere and that we don't have a monopoly on Jesus, and we can still believe that he leads our church and that other people have truth and are happy as well. Those two things can coexist. And then this last point is important too, beginning to realize religious disenchantment as an unrecognized form of social suffering. It really is so difficult of an experience, especially for returned missionaries who leave because of their identity and commitment, where it needs to be dealt with more sensitively and more in depth than it is. And so there's that point. And then last, interfaith dialogue and interaction. And I feel like would solve a lot of these, would bridge here, because it requires you to appreciate diversity from the onset, where you say, this is what I believe in, but it's okay that you believe in something different. And I think if we had more interfaith dialogue in the local levels, in our church meeting houses, and in starting to cultivate that kind of mentality of realizing that we can hold these claims and truth claims, but we can still make space for other people and for interaction with diversity, where a missionary going on their mission isn't going to interact with that diversity for the first time in their lives. And I would argue that this is required of us. I love this quote by Dr. Mason where it says, discipleship calls upon us to go beyond our own experience, to recognize the legitimacy and value of others' lives, however different they are from our own. So we have to recognize the limitations of our own faith or world framework and be vulnerable in doing so that we can make space for other people to do so as well. And then start that dialogue and maintain those relationships that we hold dear. And I feel like that's how we're going to be able to grieve properly and to move forward and keep strong relationships at the community level, at our family levels, and in our personal relationships. And that is the end of my presentation. I almost because of the military. Well, I'm going to turn on my video now. I'm not sure. I think we have a couple of minutes.
Thank you so much, Dawn Dimmick, for giving us that presentation. It was really interesting. We do have some great questions here.
Okay. Let me turn on my video.
And I've got a couple of my own. So I'm going to ask first. Here's a question. It says, I was a closeted gay missionary in the late 70s. I distanced myself from the church upon returning. Have you found that LGBT missionaries leave at a higher rate?
So I would say probably, about half of the people. I didn't get to interview a lot of people, honestly. I wish I could have done more research, but about half of the people that I did interview identified as LGBTQ, and I have a sister who identifies as a lesbian woman and has left the church since. So yeah, I would say probably. I could see that. I could definitely see that.
On a related note, did you see any difference between sisters or elders leaving? Higher rates amongst men or women?
Yeah, no, it was equal across the board from my own research. But it would be interesting too with the age change, where there have been more female missionaries historically in the past few years since that change happened. I'm sure it's probably pretty equal now. But yeah, I don't know. That's one of the areas I think would be really good to do more research on.
I guess we just need a really large sample size to answer most of these. Of returned missionaries that disassociate, how many would you say end up continuing a spiritual path of some kind or joining another organized religion?
So little to none join another organized religion. I would say probably about maybe half would have tried to navigate spirituality afterwards. But again, it's that reconciling where just the person I was talking to yesterday, my friend, who returned missionary, was talking about how sometimes they listen to Sunstone and they want to be involved in church dialogues and just conversations about religion and faith, and is dealing with existential questions and really connecting with art during this time and like things that portray that. But then at times just want to completely forget about everything to do with it. So I think it's a give and take. I think for most of the missionaries, they probably will navigate at some point, whether immediately after their faith transition or later on, they'll deal with those questions or try to connect in some way to transcendent. But it's unique to each individual for sure.
And a related question again, does serving stateside or internationally impact in any way the likelihood of leaving the church?
Okay, that's actually what I wanted to focus my whole research on at the beginning. But due to the IRB and the research stuff that the hoops I had to go through, I wasn't able to do international interviews, which was so unfortunate because that's a framework that is familiar to me that I would love to research, is the cultural impacts. Just from my own personal experience of missionaries I'm in contact with from Russia, which are very few because there's not a lot of youth that start from Russia, I would say culture definitely has an impact. So just where the missionary comes from to begin with, and then to your question on missionaries that serve stateside or internationally, I think that I feel like the pattern that I've seen, and I have no data to prove this, would just be that stateside missionaries leave more. But that's just an observation.
Right. That's anecdotal at this point, right? Not enough data. Okay, so one of the attendees and I both have a very similar question, which is, can you tell us a little bit more? We're so curious about you becoming a chaplain, as particularly an LDS chaplain. The question that was written here is, I'm not sure if I heard this correctly. Are you planning on being an LDS chaplain? The LDS Church is okay with women fulfilling that role?
Okay.
I didn't think that was allowed.
Here goes another hour-long presentation of my life story. And it ties into my presentation actually, because I've been in the military since high school. I've been in for about 6 or 7 years. And as I've been going to school, I started doing the ROTC program, and you choose your job like your senior year, and you compete for a certain slot. And so I had put in that I wanted to be a chaplain, but it was a process. So on my mission, I actually decided I wanted to be a chaplain. I was trying to figure out my fit in the military. I came back, found out that it wasn't allowed, and that the church told me a couple of times it's not allowed for females. It's just open up for females for hospital chaplaincy and other chaplains, but not for military. And I fit everything else. I was married in the church. In the temple. I was married in the temple, which is a requirement for an LDS chaplain, and everything else. So I just kept in contact with them over the course of about 2 years. So from my sophomore to senior year, and then my senior year, I really still felt guided to pursue chaplaincy. And so I still was being told no like a week before, and then I ended up putting in a slot in a weird turn of events. My social work slot that I went for, I ended up switching to chaplaincy, and then I ranked in the top 20%, so I got my first choice. So I got guaranteed chaplaincy. So when I approached the church and I said, hi, so I did this, and I'm gonna do it. And they actually said around that same time, there were some chaplains already serving LDS chaplains to approach the first presidency and said, we have females who we think could serve and we need to open it up. And so the church, the last that I talked to them, they are willing to endorse female faith basis,
at this point. It's not public knowledge, a huge basis, and they were willing to give me a shot. But then, in the process of about 4 or 5 months after hearing that news and being very excited, my husband decided to leave the church. And so that disqualified me. And that was the whole conversation that we had to have, because they needed him to be active in order for me to be able to be a chaplain. So that has opened up a whole, and personally, like, just so you know everything about my life. So I've since gotten divorced, so I'm no longer married. Well, I'm still married in the temple technically, but I am no longer married for a lot of different reasons, and we're on good terms. We just realized, as part of this project, realizing I needed to give him the space to be who he needed to be, and likewise. So I am still pursuing chaplaincy. I'm navigating this space of hoping that things are going to change, or maybe being endorsed by another church. But it is opening up for females. There's a lot of work in the process right now for that, and I continue to stay in touch with the church. Right now, I'm endorsed by a nonprofit organization that's just Christian in general, but we'll see by the end of grad school. Got 3 years to figure it out. So.
Okay, well, I hope that you will come back to Sunstone and give us some updates from time to time as to how this is going, and tell us a little bit about the diversity, I think, of an LDS person with an LDS background navigating divinity school. That's interesting too. So
I definitely will. I appreciate this.
So come back to Sunstone and fill us in. But it does look like we are out of time. I want to thank everybody who attended this session, and particularly Don Dimmick for giving us this really interesting information. I hope that we will see all of you in some of the other sessions, and that we can continue our discussion on the community chat boards. So thank you so much.